The Winder's Vale. Chapter 1, The Return of the Vale. Frosthaven was a village carved from winter's heart, its cobblestone streets and steep rooftops perpetually dusted with snow. Tucked away in a valley surrounded by jagged, snow-capped peaks, it felt like a place where time moved slower. But tonight, the air buzzed with anticipation. Tonight, the Winder's Vale would descend. Ingrid tugged her scarf tighter around her neck as she walked briskly through the market square, weaving through the crowd of villagers. Stalls lined the square, selling frosted pastries, spiced cider, and ornaments carved from ice. Laughter echoed through the air as children chased each other, their cheeks red from the cold. Everyone was excited for the Vale's arrival, everyone except Ingrid. "It's just lights in the sky," she muttered under her breath, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her face. She glanced over her shoulder at her younger brother, Kai, who lagged behind her. He was staring up at the sky, as if trying to catch a glimpse of the phenomenon that was still hours away. "It's not just lights," Kai said, his voice full of wonder. "It's magic. Don't you ever wonder where it comes from? Why it only happens here?" "No," Ingrid replied, sighing. "I wonder why people treat it like some big deal. It's just another excuse for the village to throw a festival." Kai frowned but didn't argue. At 14, he still had the curiosity and belief that Ingrid had long since abandoned. She used to share his excitement, back when their mother was alive. But after she passed, Ingrid had grown tired of the village's stories and traditions. They felt hollow, like chasing after something that wasn't real. They reached the edge of the square, where a tall platform had been built. The village elders stood at the top, wrapped in heavy cloaks, their faces solemn. One of them, Elder Freya, stepped forward and raised her arms to quiet the crowd. "Frosthaven," she called out, her voice strong despite her age. "Tonight, we welcome the Winder's Vale once more. For generations, it has blessed our valley, bringing beauty and wonder. But we must remember the old warnings, the Vale is not without its dangers. Do not venture into the woods during its descent. Stay within the village's light." A murmur ran through the crowd, part excitement, part unease. The stories of the Vale's beauty were always accompanied by darker tales, whispers of strange creatures in the woods, people who wandered too far and never returned. Ingrid rolled her eyes. "They always make it sound so dramatic," she whispered to Kai. But Kai wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the first hints of the Vale were starting to appear. A soft glow shimmered in the distance, growing brighter by the second. The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning skyward. And then it began. The sky came alive with color. Waves of light rippled across the heavens, shifting from deep blue to shimmering silver to brilliant gold. It was like watching the auroras, but denser, more tangible. The lights cascaded downward, forming a luminous curtain that enveloped the valley. The snow reflected the colors, making the entire village glow. Ingrid couldn't help but stare, her breath caught in her throat. No matter how much she pretended not to care, the Vale's beauty always took her by surprise. It felt otherworldly, as if the valley had been pulled into a dream. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, children spinning in circles under the lights. Musicians began to play, and the square transformed into a celebration. But Ingrid's attention was on Kai. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, his face lit with awe. But there was something else in his expression, something restless, searching. "Kai?" she called, but he didn't respond. She moved closer and grabbed his arm. "Kai, let's go home." "Not yet," he said, pulling away. "I just want to see it up close." "See what?" Ingrid asked, exasperated. "The edge of the Vale," he said, nodding toward the woods. Ingrid's stomach tightened. "Are you crazy? You heard what Elder Freya said. You can't go out there." Kai gave her a mischievous grin. "It's just a story. Besides, I'll stay near the edge. I just want to see what it feels like." "No, Kai," she said firmly. "We're going home. Now." But before she could grab him, he darted into the crowd. "Kai!" she shouted, but the music and laughter drowned out her voice. She pushed her way through the villagers, scanning the sea of faces, but he was already gone. Her heart pounded as she ran to the edge of the square, where the festival lights faded into the dark outlines of the trees. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she searched for any sign of him. Then she saw it, his footprints, leading toward the woods. Ingrid's breath caught in her throat. The woods were forbidden during the Vale, not just because of the legends, but because of how easy it was to get lost in the shifting light. She stared into the forest, where the trees glowed faintly with the colors of the Vale. Her instincts told her to wait, to find the elders, to let someone else handle it. But she knew Kai. If she didn't go after him, no one would find him in time. Muttering a curse under her breath, she stepped into the woods, following his footprints. The air grew colder as the trees closed in around her, their branches heavy with snow. The light of the village faded behind her, replaced by the eerie glow of the Vale. The colors danced across the forest floor, casting strange shadows that seemed to shift and move. "Kai!" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Ingrid quickened her pace, her eyes darting between the footprints and the forest around her. The woods felt alive, the air humming with energy. She tried to ignore the whispers at the edge of her hearing, the flickers of movement in her peripheral vision. Then, just ahead, she saw a faint glow. A figure stood in the distance, silhouetted by the Vale's light. "Kai?" she called, relief flooding her chest. But as she stepped closer, the figure turned, and it wasn't Kai. It was something else. Chapter 2, The Vanishing. Ingrid froze. The figure standing before her was tall and thin, its silhouette almost human but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too smooth, like a shadow cast by something that didn't belong in this world. The shimmering lights of the Vale seemed to bend around it, distorting its form as if the creature were a tear in reality itself. It turned its head toward her, though she couldn't see a face. Only darkness. Fear gripped her chest like a vice, but she forced herself to stay still. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but if this thing had seen Kai, she couldn't afford to let it slip away. "Where is my brother?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as though considering her words. For a moment, it didn't move, and Ingrid dared to take a step forward. Then it vanished. Not into the shadows or the trees, it simply blinked out of existence, leaving nothing but the faint shimmer of the Vale behind. Ingrid exhaled shakily, her knees threatening to buckle. Her heart raced as she scanned the forest, but the figure was gone. The silence around her was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the Vale's light. "Kai," she whispered, her voice cracking. She knelt to examine the snow beneath her feet. The footprints were still there, heading deeper into the woods. She followed them, her breath puffing out in clouds as the air grew colder. The forest seemed to change as she walked. The trees were no longer familiar, their trunks twisted, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the stars. The light of the Vale illuminated the path ahead, casting shifting patterns on the ground. Ingrid felt like she was walking through a dream, or a nightmare. The footprints led her to a small clearing. In the center was a tree unlike any she had ever seen. Its trunk was black and smooth, as if carved from obsidian, and its branches glowed faintly with silver light. Beneath the tree, the snow was undisturbed. Kai's footprints stopped just short of its roots. "Kai?" she called again, louder this time. No answer. Panic surged through her as she circled the tree, searching for any sign of him. It was as though he had simply disappeared. She felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. "No," she said aloud, clenching her fists. "You don't get to do this, Kai. You don't get to just vanish. I'm not leaving without you." As she spoke, the air around her shifted. A faint, melodic hum rose from the tree, resonating deep in her chest. Ingrid stepped back, her heart pounding. The light on the tree's branches grew brighter, and for a moment, she thought she saw shapes moving within the glow. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and the light flared. Ingrid shielded her eyes, stumbling backward as the world seemed to spin. When the light faded, she opened her eyes to find the clearing empty. The tree was gone. "What is happening?" she whispered, her voice shaking. A sound behind her made her spin around. It was faint but distinct, the crunch of snow underfoot. "Kai?" she called, hope flaring in her chest. But it wasn't her brother. A man stepped into the clearing, his face shadowed by the hood of his dark cloak. He carried a lantern that glowed with an unnatural blue light, casting eerie shadows across his sharp features. His piercing eyes locked onto Ingrid, and he stopped a few feet away, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and even. "I'm looking for my brother," Ingrid said, taking a step back. "Have you seen him?" The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You're chasing shadows," he said. "The Vale is no place for the unprepared." "Who are you?" Ingrid demanded, her fear giving way to frustration. "And what do you mean, unprepared?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past her, his eyes scanning the forest as though searching for something. Finally, he said, "I am someone who knows the dangers of this place. And I know this: if you continue down this path, You may never find your way back. I don't care about the path, Ingrid snapped. I care about finding Kai. Do you know where he is or not? The man's gaze softened, just slightly. If he passed through here, he is further than you can imagine. The veil distorts more than light, it twists time and space. The boy may already be beyond your reach. No, Ingrid said, shaking her head. That's not true. I saw his footprints. He's close, I know it. The man sighed, as though weary of arguing. If you insist on following, I cannot stop you. But you must understand, the veil does not abide by the rules of your world. And the deeper you go, the harder it will be to leave. I don't care, she said again, her voice firm. I'll do whatever it takes to find him. The man studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. If you're determined to continue, you'll need a guide. Are you offering to help? She asked warily. I am offering to keep you alive, he replied. For as long as I can. Ingrid hesitated, unsure whether to trust him. But the alternative, wandering the forest alone, seemed far worse. Fine, she said. But if you're lying to me, you'll regret it. The man's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. Noted. With that, he turned and began walking toward the edge of the clearing. Ingrid followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The woods closed in around them once more, the light of the veil casting shifting shadows on the ground. Ingrid glanced at the man's lantern, its blue glow cutting through the darkness. What's your name? She asked. Soren, he replied without looking back. And why are you out here? He paused, his shoulders tensing. Because I've been here before. And I know what it takes to get out. The weight of his words settled over her, and for the first time, she realized just how dangerous this journey might be. But she couldn't turn back now. Not without Kai. As they moved deeper into the woods, the whispers of the veil grew louder, and Ingrid felt the shadows closing in around her. This was only the beginning. Chapter 3, Into the Forbidden Woods. The forest seemed alive. As Ingrid followed Soren deeper into the woods, the trees whispered, their twisted branches creaking as though they carried secrets too heavy to bear. The air hummed with an energy that set her teeth on edge, and the colors of the veil danced along the snow like living creatures. She clutched the strap of her satchel, her knuckles white, and tried to focus on the path ahead. Soren moved with purpose, his lantern casting a pale blue light that pushed back the encroaching shadows. Ingrid wasn't sure whether the light came from a flame or something else entirely. Whatever it was, the shadows recoiled from its glow. How much farther? Ingrid asked, her voice breaking the eerie silence. Soren glanced over his shoulder. The veil doesn't work like the world you know. Distance and time. They're pliable here. Your brother could be a few steps ahead or miles away. That's not an answer, she said, frustration creeping into her voice. It's the only answer I can give you, he replied. The veil isn't meant to be traveled. It's meant to keep things out, and sometimes, keep things in. Ingrid frowned, her breath visible in the cold air. Why does everyone in the village just accept it? They celebrate it like it's harmless. Soren's expression darkened. Because they don't know what's really out here. They see the lights and tell themselves it's a blessing. It's easier to believe in beauty than danger. She fell silent, chewing on his words. As much as she hated to admit it, the stories about the veil were vague. The warnings always seemed like superstitions, the kind used to scare children into behaving. But now, walking through these shifting woods, she wasn't so sure. The sound of snow crunching underfoot was suddenly drowned out by a low, guttural growl. Ingrid froze. What was that? She whispered. Soren stopped, raising his lantern higher. The blue light flared, and the shadows around them seemed to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. Stay close, he said, his voice low. Another growl echoed through the trees, this time closer. Ingrid's heart pounded as she scanned the forest, but the light of the veil played tricks on her eyes. Every flicker and shimmer felt like movement, like something lurking just out of sight. What's out there? She asked, gripping Soren's arm. Shadows, he said simply. Before she could ask what that meant, something lunged out of the darkness. It moved too fast to see clearly, a blur of black against the shimmering light. Soren shoved Ingrid to the ground and swung the lantern in a wide arc. The creature recoiled, a high-pitched screech tearing through the air as the blue light touched it. Ingrid scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. The creature circled them, its movements unnaturally fluid. It had no defined shape, only a writhing mess of shadow that flickered and stretched like smoke caught in a wind. What is that thing? Ingrid shouted. One of the Veil's creations, Soren said, his voice calm despite the tension in his posture. It feeds on fear and doubt. Don't give it either. How do I not be afraid of that? Soren didn't answer. Instead, he thrust the lantern toward the creature, forcing it to retreat. The shadow hissed, its form twisting and shrinking before darting back into the trees. Soren turned to Ingrid, his face grim. We need to move. Quickly. He grabbed her arm and pulled her forward, the two of them breaking into a run. Ingrid stumbled over roots and uneven snow, her breath coming in short gasps. The whispers in the forest grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of unintelligible voices. The shadows moved with them, darting between the trees. Ingrid could feel their presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. What do they want? She asked, her voice trembling. To pull you into their world, Soren said without slowing. They exist between the veil and the dark. If they take you, you'll never come back. Panic surged through her, but she clenched her fists and kept running. The forest seemed endless, the path twisting and turning without rhyme or reason. Finally, they burst into another clearing. Soren stopped abruptly, raising the lantern to scan their surroundings. Ingrid doubled over, her hands on her knees as she struggled to catch her breath. Are we safe? She asked, her voice shaking. For now, he said, lowering the lantern. The light keeps them at bay, but it won't last forever. She straightened, glaring at him. You could have warned me about the monsters before we came out here. I told you the veil is dangerous, Soren said, his tone flat. You chose to follow anyway. Before she could retort, a faint sound reached her ears, a voice, distant but unmistakable. Ingrid. Her head snapped up. Kai? The voice came again, clearer this time. It was definitely Kai, calling her name. She turned toward the sound, but Soren grabbed her arm. Wait. That's my brother, she said, pulling away. It might be, Soren said carefully. Or it might be something else. The veil plays tricks. It can mimic voices, memories. Anything to lure you deeper. Ingrid hesitated, her gut twisting. She wanted to believe it was Kai, but Soren's words planted a seed of doubt. Ingrid. The voice sounded closer now, desperate. I have to try, she said, stepping toward the sound. Soren sighed, then held out his lantern. Take this. You'll need it more than I will. What about you? I can manage, he said. But if you run into another shadow, keep the lantern between you and it. And don't let the light go out. She nodded, taking the lantern with trembling hands. Its blue glow was warm against her skin, a small comfort in the oppressive darkness. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Soren replied. Find your brother, and don't stray from the light. With that, Ingrid turned and followed the sound of Kai's voice, the lantern lighting her way. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. But she pressed on, her grip on the lantern tightening. Kai. She called, her voice breaking. Ingrid. The voice was closer now, just beyond the next grove of trees. Her heart raced as she broke into a run, the lantern swinging in her hand. She reached the grove and stopped short. Standing in the clearing was Kai. He turned to face her, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. Ingrid, he said, his voice trembling. Help me. Relief flooded her, and she rushed toward him. But as she drew closer, something about him seemed off. His features were too sharp, his movements too stiff, like a puppet on strings. She stopped, holding the lantern higher. The blue light washed over him, and his form flickered like a reflection on water. Kai? She whispered, her voice trembling. He smiled, a cold, unnatural smile, and his eyes turned black. Ingrid, he said, his voice distorted. Come closer. Chapter 4, The Imposter. Ingrid's breath caught in her throat as the thing that wore her brother's face tilted its head, the unnatural smile stretching wider. The blackness in its eyes seemed to swirl, pulling in the light from her lantern like a vortex. Her hand shook as she tightened her grip on the lantern's handle. The glow flickered, but its soft blue light didn't falter. Kai? She said again, though deep down she knew the truth. The figure took a step forward, its movements stiff and jerky, as though it hadn't quite figured out how to mimic a human gait. Ingrid, it said, its voice layered with an echo that sent shivers down her spine. I've been waiting for you. Come closer. No, she said, taking a step back. The imposter paused, its smile faltering. Why are you afraid? It's me. Your brother. Don't you want to save me?" Her heart ached at the sound of his voice, but her instincts screamed that this wasn't Kai. She had seen the flicker, the unnatural way its form shifted in the lantern's light. Whatever this thing was, it was a lie. "You're not him," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. The imposter's expression changed. The smile twisted into a snarl, and its form began to ripple, the edges of its body dissolving into black mist. Its voice deepened, growing guttural and filled with malice. "He's gone, Ingrid. And soon, you'll be gone too." It lunged. Ingrid screamed and stumbled backward, holding the lantern out in front of her. The blue light flared, and the creature recoiled, hissing like steam escaping a boiling kettle. Its form wavered, shifting between the shape of her brother and something monstrous, long, clawed limbs and a face without features. The shadows around her seemed to come alive, closing in with every passing second. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the cold bit at her skin like needles. Ingrid's mind raced. She couldn't fight this thing, not with her bare hands. But Soren had said to keep the lantern's light between her and the shadows. She tightened her grip and swung the lantern in a wide arc. The creature howled, its body flickering like a flame caught in the wind. It shrank back, but the shadows didn't retreat entirely. They circled her, their movements fluid and relentless, as though waiting for the light to falter. "I'm not afraid of you," she shouted, though her voice wavered. The creature hissed, its form solidifying into a distorted version of Kai. "You should be," it growled. Ingrid took another step back, her eyes darting around the clearing. There was no sign of Soren, and the path she had taken was swallowed by the darkness. She was alone, surrounded. But she wasn't helpless. The lantern. She raised it higher, the glow intensifying as if responding to her resolve. The creature snarled and lunged again, but this time, she thrust the lantern forward. The light erupted in a blinding flash, illuminating the clearing and forcing the shadows to scatter. The creature screamed, its body unraveling like threads pulled from fabric. It writhed and twisted, its voice a cacophony of rage and pain, before it dissolved into the night. Ingrid stumbled back, her chest heaving as she clutched the lantern. The clearing was quiet now, save for the faint hum of the Vale's light. But she wasn't safe. Not yet. She turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of movement. The forest loomed around her, the trees twisted and unnatural. Her hands trembled, but she refused to let go of the lantern. "Kai," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Where are you?" The sound of footsteps made her spin around, the lantern swinging in her grasp. It was Soren. He stepped into the clearing, his dark cloak blending with the shadows. His face was unreadable as he approached, his eyes flicking between the lantern and the empty space where the creature had been. "You're alive," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. "Thanks for the help," she snapped, anger masking the fear that still churned in her stomach. "I told you not to stray from the light," he said, his tone even. Her glare softened as exhaustion settled over her. "I heard Kai. Or at least, I thought I did. It wasn't him, was it?" Soren shook his head. "No. The Vale uses what it finds in your mind, your fears, your memories, your hopes. It twists them to keep you here." Ingrid swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Then how do I know anything out here is real? How do I know you're real?" He met her gaze, his expression serious. "You don't. That's why you have to trust yourself. Not what you see, not what you hear, just yourself." She nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. "I can't leave without him," she said. "I won't." "Then we keep moving," Soren said, gesturing for her to follow. She hesitated, then fell into step beside him. The lantern's light flickered but held steady, illuminating the path ahead. As they walked, the forest seemed to change again. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining to form an archway overhead. The air grew colder, and the whispers of the Vale became distant, replaced by an eerie silence. "What's this place?" Ingrid asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The heart of the Vale," Soren said. "If your brother is anywhere, it's here. But be warned, the deeper we go, the more dangerous it becomes." "I'm not turning back," she said firmly. Soren glanced at her, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Good. Because once we cross into the heart, there's no turning back anyway." As they stepped beneath the archway of branches, Ingrid felt a strange sensation wash over her, a mix of dread and anticipation. The Vale seemed to pulse around them, its light dimming and brightening in time with her heartbeat. She tightened her grip on the lantern and took a deep breath. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. for Kai. Chapter 5, The Heart of Shadows. The forest's transformation was immediate. The moment Ingrid and Soren passed beneath the arched branches, the air grew thicker, as if the veil itself were pressing down on them. The ground beneath Ingrid's boots shifted, the snow replaced by blackened earth that seemed to pulse faintly with every step. The glow of the lantern dimmed slightly, its blue light struggling against the oppressive darkness. Ingrid tightened her grip, her knuckles white. "Stay close," Soren said, his voice low. "I wasn't planning on wandering off again," she muttered, though her attempt at humor fell flat. The path ahead was narrow, the trees on either side growing impossibly tall and leaning inward, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the faint hum of the lantern. "How much farther?" Ingrid asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Soren glanced back at her, his face shadowed. "The heart of the veil isn't a place. It's a presence. We'll know when we've reached it." "That's not comforting." It wasn't meant to be. As they pressed on, Ingrid became aware of a strange sensation, a faint pull, as though the forest itself was trying to draw her deeper. Her thoughts felt foggy, her memories slipping through her fingers like water. She shook her head, trying to focus, but the feeling only grew stronger. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Soren nodded. "The veil is testing you. Don't let it take hold." "How do I fight it?" "Hold on to what's real. Your brother. The reason you're here. Don't let the veil distract you." Ingrid nodded, repeating Kai's name in her mind like a mantra. But the pull was relentless, tugging at the edges of her consciousness. Then she heard it. "Ingrid." The voice was faint, almost too soft to hear, but it sent a chill down her spine. She froze, her eyes darting around the forest. Soren stopped and turned to her. "Ignore it," he said firmly. It sounded like. "It's not him," Soren said, cutting her off. "The veil knows your weakness. It'll use everything against you." She nodded, though her heart ached at the sound of Kai's voice. They continued walking, the path growing darker with each step. The lantern's glow flickered, and Ingrid's grip tightened. The pull grew stronger, the air thick with an almost palpable tension. Finally, the path opened into a vast clearing. Ingrid gasped. The heart of the veil was unlike anything she had imagined. A massive, pulsating mass of light and shadow hovered in the center of the clearing, its form constantly shifting. Tendrils of darkness stretched outward, writhing like living things, while streaks of light flickered and danced within. The air around it crackled with energy, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. "What is that?" Ingrid whispered. "The veil," Soren said, his voice hushed. "Or at least, its core. Everything you've seen, everything you've felt, it all comes from this." Ingrid stared at the shifting mass, her heart pounding. "Is Kai in there?" Soren nodded. "If he's alive, yes. But the veil won't give him up without a fight." "What do I do?" she asked, her voice shaking. Soren turned to her, his expression grim. "The lantern will protect you, but only for so long. The veil will try to take you, just as it took him. You have to fight it. Stay focused. Remember why you're here." Ingrid swallowed hard, her throat dry. "And what about you?" "I'll do what I can," he said. "But this is your battle. Your bond with Kai is what will bring him back." She nodded, steeling herself. "Let's do this." As they stepped into the clearing, the veil reacted immediately. The tendrils of darkness surged toward them, but the lantern's light flared, holding them at bay. Ingrid felt a wave of nausea as the air around her seemed to warp, the ground shifting beneath her feet. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. "Ingrid," they called, blending into a chorus of voices. "Come to us. Stay with us." She shook her head, gripping the lantern tightly. "I'm not listening to you," she shouted. The veil responded with a deafening roar, its tendrils lashing out. Soren stepped forward, drawing a blade that gleamed with the same blue light as the lantern. He slashed at the shadows, forcing them back. "Go," he shouted. "Find him." Ingrid hesitated, fear clawing at her chest. But she forced herself to move, stepping closer to the heart of the veil. As she approached, the whispers grew louder, turning into screams. The tendrils lashed out, but the lantern's light shielded her. She reached the edge of the shifting mass and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "Kai," she called, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was no response. Then, she saw him. Kai's form appeared within the swirling mess, his body suspended as though trapped in ice. His eyes were closed, his face pale. "Kai," she shouted again, tears streaming down her face. He didn't move. Ingrid took a deep breath and stepped closer, the lantern trembling in her hand. The veil's tendrils lashed out, striking the light, but it held firm. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the mass. A surge of cold shot through her arm, and she cried out, but she didn't pull away. "Kai," she said, her voice firm. "I'm here. Wake up." His eyes fluttered open. "Ingrid?" he whispered, his voice weak. She sobbed in relief, her heart soaring. "Yes, it's me. Hold on." The veil roared, its tendrils tightening around Kai. The lantern's light flickered, and Ingrid felt the pull intensify. The whispers grew deafening, filling her mind with doubts and fears. "You can't save him," the voices said. "He's ours. You'll fail, just like everyone else." "No," she shouted, gripping the lantern with both hands. "I won't let you have him." The light flared, brighter than ever. The veil screamed, its tendrils writhing and pulling back. Ingrid reached forward, grabbing Kai's hand and pulling with all her strength. For a moment, it felt as though the veil would tear her apart. The darkness wrapped around her, pulling her toward the heart of the mass. But she held on, her love for Kai giving her strength. Finally, with one last surge of light, the veil shattered. The clearing was engulfed in a brilliant blue glow, and the tendrils dissolved into mist. The whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence. Ingrid collapsed to the ground, clutching Kai in her arms. Kai's form appeared within the swirling mess, his body suspended as though trapped in ice. His eyes were closed, his face pale. "Kai," she shouted again, tears streaming down her face. He didn't move. Ingrid took a deep breath and stepped closer, the lantern trembling in her hand. The veil's tendrils lashed out, striking the light, but it held firm. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the mass. A surge of cold shot through her arm, and she cried out, but she didn't pull away. "Kai," she said, her voice firm. "I'm here. Wake up." His eyes fluttered open. "Ingrid?" he whispered, his voice weak. She sobbed in relief, her heart soaring. "Yes, it's me. Hold on." The veil roared, its tendrils tightening around Kai. The lantern's light flickered, and Ingrid felt the pull intensify. The whispers grew deafening, filling her mind with doubts and fears. "You can't save him," the voices said. "He's ours. You'll fail, just like everyone else." "No," she shouted, gripping the lantern with both hands. "I won't let you have him." The light flared, brighter than ever. The veil screamed, its tendrils writhing and pulling back. Ingrid reached forward, grabbing Kai's hand and pulling with all her strength. For a moment, it felt as though the veil would tear her apart. The darkness wrapped around her, pulling her toward the heart of the mass. But she held on, her love for Kai giving her strength. Finally, with one last surge of light, the veil shattered. The clearing was engulfed in a brilliant blue glow, and the tendrils dissolved into mist. The whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence. Ingrid collapsed to the ground, clutching Kai in her arms. "What kind of sacrifice?" Soren stood, his dark silhouette framed against the faint shimmer of the veil's remnants. The light of the lantern. "It's bound to you now, Ingrid. It's the only thing that can destroy the connection between your brother and the veil." Ingrid stared at the lantern, its soft blue glow barely holding on. It had been her shield, her guide, her only source of hope in the darkness. Without it, she wasn't sure how they would make it out of the forest. "But if I give it up," she said slowly, "what happens to us? To him?" Soren's gaze was steady. "The veil will lose its hold on him. But you'll have no protection. You'll have to rely on each other to find your way out." The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a stone. She looked at Kai, his face pale but his eyes filled with trust. He had been trapped in the veil's grasp for who knew how long, and now that she had him back, she couldn't bear the thought of losing him again. "I'll do it," she said, her voice resolute. Soren nodded. "Then be ready. The veil won't let go without a fight." Ingrid knelt beside Kai, her heart racing as she lifted the lantern. Its light flickered weakly, as though sensing what was about to happen. "What are you doing?" Kai asked, his voice trembling. "Saving you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She placed the lantern on the ground between them and took a deep breath. Closing her eyes, she focused on the bond she shared with Kai, the laughter, the arguments, the countless memories that tied them together. The lantern flared, its light growing brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. The air around them crackled with energy, and the faint shimmer of the Veil's presence surged, lashing out like a wounded animal. "Ingrid!" Soren shouted. The ground trembled, and the tendrils of darkness began to reappear, twisting and writhing as they reached for the light. Ingrid gritted her teeth, her hands steady as she held onto the lantern. "I won't let you have him!" she screamed, pouring every ounce of her strength into the lantern's glow. The light erupted, a brilliant burst that consumed the clearing. The tendrils of darkness dissolved into ash, and the faint shimmer of the Veil shattered like glass, its remnants scattering into the wind. For a moment, there was silence. Then the lantern went dark. Ingrid collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. She reached for Kai, relief flooding through her as she saw the color returning to his cheeks. "It's over," she whispered, her voice shaking. Kai sat up slowly, his gaze meeting hers. "You did it," he said, awe and gratitude in his voice. Soren approached, his expression somber but not unkind. "You've severed the Veil's hold," he said. "But the forest won't let you leave easily. You'll need to be strong to make it out." Ingrid stood, helping Kai to his feet. "We've come this far," she said. "We're not giving up now." Soren nodded, his dark eyes lingering on the extinguished lantern. "I'll guide you as far as I can. But the rest is up to you." The three of them began to walk, the clearing fading into the dense forest once more. The path was faint, the darkness pressing in on all sides, but Ingrid held onto Kai's hand, her heart steady. The Veil was behind them now, its whispers silenced, its grip broken. But the journey home was still ahead, and the forest was not kind to those who lingered. As they walked, Ingrid felt a faint warmth in her chest, a spark of light, small but unyielding. It wasn't the lantern that had guided her, she realized. It had been her love for her brother all along. And that light, she knew, would never go out. Chapter 7, The Way Home. The forest seemed quieter now, though the weight of the Veil's presence still lingered in the air. The trees no longer loomed as menacingly, but their branches still hung heavy, like mourners watching the trio's slow progress. Ingrid clutched Kai's hand as they walked, her other hand resting on his shoulder to steady him. Each step was a struggle, his body still weak from his time within the Veil. Soren led the way, his movements swift and assured despite the dim light. Without the lantern, their only guide was the faint shimmer of moonlight filtering through the skeletal canopy above. "How much farther?" Ingrid asked, her voice tight with exhaustion. Soren glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "The Veil's grip is weakest now. If we keep moving, we'll reach the edge of the forest by dawn." "Dawn," Kai murmured, his voice hoarse. "It feels like I haven't seen the sun in years." Ingrid squeezed his hand. "You will. Just hold on a little longer." The ground beneath them shifted, the blackened earth giving way to patches of snow. The forest around them began to change, the twisted, gnarled trees growing straighter and more familiar. Ingrid felt a flicker of hope, perhaps they really were nearing the edge. But the forest wasn't done with them yet. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder with every step. They weren't the same as before, these were desperate, pleading. "Don't leave us," the voices called. "Stay. We can make you whole." Kai stumbled, his knees buckling. Ingrid caught him just in time, her arms wrapping around his waist. "Kai," she said, panic rising in her chest. "I'm fine," he said weakly, though his trembling hands told a different story. "It's just hard to walk." Soren turned, his dark eyes narrowing. "The Veil is trying to pull him back. It won't let go easily." "What do we do?" Ingrid asked, her voice frantic. "Keep moving," Soren said sharply. "Don't stow." The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting to something more familiar. "Ingrid," one voice called, a woman's voice, soft and full of sorrow. "Why are you leaving me?" Ingrid froze. It was her mother's voice. She turned instinctively, her heart pounding, and saw a figure standing among the trees. It was her mother, or at least, it looked like her. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes rimmed with tears. "You left me," the figure said, her voice trembling. "You never came back." Ingrid's breath caught in her throat. Memories of her mother flooded her mind, her warm smile, her gentle hands, the way she used to hum lullabies while braiding Ingrid's hair. "It's not real," Soren barked, his voice cutting through the haze. "Don't look at it." "Ingrid?" Kai's voice pulled her back. His hand tightened around hers, grounding her. She tore her gaze away from the figure, forcing herself to focus on Kai. He was real. He was here. The whispers turned angry, their tone sharp and accusatory. The figure of her mother dissolved into mist, replaced by more shadows that writhed and clawed at the edges of the path. "You're nothing without us," the voices hissed. "You'll fail. You'll lose him again." "Keep walking," Soren shouted. Ingrid gritted her teeth and pushed forward, half dragging Kai as they stumbled through the forest. The path narrowed, the trees pressing in on either side, but the faint shimmer of light ahead spurred her on. Then the shadows surged. A wall of darkness rose up in front of them, its tendrils lashing out like snakes. Ingrid felt a cold grip around her ankle, pulling her back. She cried out, struggling to free herself, but the darkness held tight. Soren turned, his blade flashing as he slashed at the tendrils. "Keep moving," he yelled. "I can't," Ingrid shouted, her voice trembling with fear. Kai, despite his weakness, knelt beside her. He grabbed the tendril around her ankle with both hands, his jaw clenched in. The tendril hissed and recoiled, dissolving into mist. Ingrid scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. "Thanks," she said, her voice shaky. Kai gave her a weak smile. "I owe you one." The shadows roared, their forms shifting into monstrous shapes that towered above them. Soren stepped forward, his blade glowing faintly as he faced the darkness. "I'll hold them off," he said. "You two, run." "What?" Ingrid protested. "You can't." "Go," Soren shouted, his voice filled with an authority that brooked no argument. Ingrid hesitated, her eyes locking with Soren's. There was a finality in his gaze, a silent understanding that this was his role to play. "Come on," Kai said, tugging at her arm. With a heavy heart, she turned and ran, half supporting Kai as they made their way down the narrowing path. The sounds of battle echoed behind them, Soren's blade slicing through the air, the roars of the shadows growing fainter with every step. Finally, the trees parted, and the forest opened into a vast, snow-covered field. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. "We made it," Ingrid whispered, tears streaming down her face. Kai slumped against her, his strength nearly gone, but he managed a faint smile. "You did it." Ingrid turned back to the forest, her heart aching. The shadows were gone, and the path they had taken was now shrouded in mist. There was no sign of Soren. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. As the sun rose higher, the warmth of its light banished the lingering chill of the veil. Ingrid and Kai stood together, their bond stronger than ever, as they began the journey home. The forest was behind them now, its secrets left to the shadows. But they carried its lessons with them, the strength of love, the power of hope, and the light that could never be extinguished.